Here's what my miter saw is doing. I start it up, and it keeps running. The problem is this guy right here, this little switch, it gets stuck, and so I'm going to replace it. First, we want to unplug everything because these are hot wires and we don't want to touch them. Okay. First is disassembly of the handle. As you can see, I've already taken the screws out. There are 8 total to remove. You do not have to remove this handle. There are 4 of these relatively coarse thread screws and 4 of these fine thread screws that need to be removed. Once you've done that, this all comes apart. And again, I am unplugged, so none of this wiring is hot. I did my best to find a replacement switch for this guy right here, and this thing right here is what I found. It is clearly not an exact replacement because, as you can see, this handle and this handle are quite different from each other. It does have this mounting hole right here, which seems to line up with that mounting hole. But as I found to my dismay, the switch is not actually set up the same way, so I'll show you the problem. Now we need to take the switch assembly out, and there are 2 points where it attaches. This little screw right here, and then this retaining ring. This thing is easy to take off just by getting a little clip and prying up these little teeth off just ever so slightly, and once you do that, it'll come off. These teeth are kind of biting into the plastic, and this either a flathead or a hex head screwdriver will take that out. So I've already bent these teeth up a little bit, so the ring should be easy to pop out. Alright, now our assembly comes out. So here's the problem. You can see on this diagram that there's pin 1 to pin 1, it is a normally open contact, and pin 2 to pin 2 is a normally closed contact. So right now, with the switch not depressed, these are shorted to each other and these are open. So this is actually the break, and this is actually the supply of 110 volts. When you squeeze on the trigger, it closes this, and you end up supplying electricity to the motor, and it turns. When you let go of it, it ends up closing the contact here, and this actually ends up connecting the wiring in the reverse direction, and so the residual speed of the motor continues to generate a magnetic field, but in the opposite direction it ends up braking the motor. So that's how this electric brake actually works, even when power is not actually applied. The problem is, this thing that I bought, in addition to having a handle that is not exactly the same, is not wired the same. You can see that both of the pole 1s are on one side and both of the number 2s are on the other side. So I've still got the completely open and completely closed, but the wires that go together are on the same side of the switch instead of going on the opposite side of the switch. So I've got to deal with that. We'll take this out, take that off, and we're just going to disconnect this switch. And all we're going to do is take these wires, and since this black needs to connect to this black, we're just going to route one of these around to the other side and one of these around to the other side. Alright, so let's see which one we need to route where. The normally open, which is number 1, is the power, and that is on the right hand side, so both of the black ones need to be on this side, and the red and yellow need to be on this side. So the red is already in the right place, and I don't need to reroute him, but the yellow is going to need to move over here. And this black is going to need to move over here. Alright, so let's try removing this thing. Alright, so one thing to notice that is different is that all these wires are are expecting to be screwed down here, and these are expected to slide on, so I'm probably going to have to remove these and just screw it into there. But as we already figured out, we want to use the number 1 is where the AC goes. So AC goes on this side, that's this side, that's this side, so both of the blacks need to be on this side here. Okay, there's our original switch. Here's our new one. They are similar but not the same. Let's look at how the switch works. So this is the one that I took out of the saw, and we have the connection here when the switch is not depressed and an open here, so let's see if that's true. Okay, I hear the beeping, so we've got a connection. We've got a short. So if I squeeze the trigger, it goes off, back on. Alright, now let's try the other side. Okay, there we have an open. And close. So that's what's happening with this switch. Alright, without the tabs, will it fit on the hole? Yes, it will. So it's just going to kind of sit in there at an angle. And it's not ideal, but I think I can make it work. Alright, all the screws are out. We decided that the black needs to go on this side, so how do we get enough length to make that happen? We may not have enough length, which kind of stinks. And we do not have enough length. Darn it. Well, that stinks too. Clearly I've got enough on this side. So I will be able to connect both of these over here. So let's go ahead and do that. Alright, that's going to work. Now, unfortunately, I've got to extend this wire. Okay, I have gathered some materials and found some wiring that I can use. So I had some old wiring that looks like the same gauge as the wiring here. One thing that's interesting to notice is this wire, which comes from the power cord, is copper, and it's difficult to see this one, but the one that supplies the motor, what we do not see is the color of copper there. This is aluminum wire, and this actually has writing on it that says it's 16 gauge. So because the same current has to flow through this as has to flow through here when it's on, that implies the weaker of these is still sufficient to carry the current. So they've decided that 16 gauge stranded aluminum wire is acceptable. I happen to have 16 gauge stranded aluminum wire. That's what came out of this. So I am going to solder these two together so that I can get the extra length I need, and I'm going to make sure that the joint exists in this little cavity right here. And then once I have them joined, I'll cut this one to length, and then I will add the spade on it. What I'm going to do to join these wires is I'm going to solder them, and there's going to be several steps involved. I will tin the wires, solder them together, and then slip 2 layers of heat shrink tubing over them, a smaller layer and a thicker one. What I'm going to do to join these wires is tin the 2 wires, I'll explain what that means, solder them together, and then I will slip 2 layers of heat shrink tubing over them. Once they're all together, I'll put them in place, and I will cut this wire to length and add the spade to it. First thing we do is tin the wires. So we're going to apply some flux to the ends of the wires. And then we will get some solder. And our already heated soldering iron, and just apply solder to the wires. Alright, now we've got a nice little amount of solder on this wire, and we'll do the same thing for this one. See it a lot easier on the copper wire. Alright, that is a nicely tinned wire. Now that we have tinning on both of those wires, they have the solder that will allow us to put them together. And so here's the trick where you really need 3 hands. The problem is, if you try to hold this with one hand, you have to end up, even if you're able to hold the pieces together, you have to hold them close enough to each other that the wires get hot and you burn your fingers. So we got to figure out a way to hold these together while the solder melts. Alright, what I decided to do to hold the wire down is just get a clamp, and I'm not tightening it down or anything, I'm just letting it rest on the wire. So it should hold it. Then I can use 2 hands. I put the 2 tin wires next to each other. I had to change soldering irons because I wasn't getting enough heat out of the old one. And we've got a good joint there. Alright. I'm going to clamp these together a little bit so that it's easy to get the heat shrink over them. And there's what our joint looks like. Alright, now I'm going to slip heat shrink over the end. Hopefully it is big enough to get over these wires, and it is. And we'll get the heat gun and shrink it. And this is probably sufficient, but when it's 120 volts, I like to have a little more protection, so I'm going to double layer the heat shrink. Alright, now I have a longer wire. So I should be able to put the new part down in here and then deal with the excess back over there. And now I can connect. So now I just got to figure out what length to cut it at. And it's okay to have just a little bit of extra, but I've basically got to attach this to this. So I'm going to give it a little extra length, which means I'm going to cut it right there. Don't need a lot. Don't need a lot to stick out. So you can barely see it right there. That means the length is perfect. So we should be able to take this, and that'll have enough length once I bend this up to attach right there. So let's clamp that. All right, now we're going to add this little spade. I don't have a crimper, but this pliers with this little spot right here does a pretty good job of crimping. So let's see if we can make that work. Not the prettiest thing in the world, but it's a solid connection. Alright, I think my wires are all long enough, so let's route them and see if we can make this work. It's going to go there. So a reasonable question is, does it matter which one goes to which? It really doesn't. There's this switch is going to connect these two. There's not a direction, so whichever one is most convenient for routing the wire is all you need to do. For this one, I'm going to bend it so that it makes it better. All right. And are you kidding me? I didn't make it long enough. Okay, damn. Well, that's dumb. I'm going to make it work regardless, but that is really annoying. We at least have that. So now let's see if I can make this fit. So I screwed up and didn't make this long enough to fit this in that socket, so I'm just going to have to deal with shoving this in wherever it fits. So that's annoying. This one is also trying to not be long enough. So before we screw everything else together, let's try putting the handle back on, plugging it in, and seeing what happens. Alright, we are plugged in. Survey says. Turn off my vacuum there. I'd say that works better. So let's screw all this in and finish this job. Okay, remember the fine thread screws go back here, and the coarse thread screws go in the front. So coarse thread, fine thread. I want to make sure that there are no wires between the pieces of plastic, and that they close completely. Since this is just plastic, you don't want to get these too tight, so otherwise you'll strip it out. So I would call this monkey tight rather than gorilla tight. That one is stripped, unfortunately. See, I'm able to keep turning that one just using my fingertips, so unfortunately that one's no good. Alright, so ceremonial first cut. Beautiful. So I wanted to show a difference in the two handles now that I've got this all fixed. Here's the original handle, and you can see that it would have gone across the entire opening there. And this new trigger, the new switch with the new trigger, clearly it doesn't. So I guess I just need to not stick my fingers in there. That's a little bit unsafe. That is a downside to doing it this way, and I probably need to get a little piece of wood or something in there to block fingers. And while I had it open, I took the opportunity to stick a little piece of wood right in there from a paint stick. And that just keeps my finger from getting anywhere close to any of the hot connections on that switch. So now it should be pretty hard to injure myself, at least electrically. So it's now a couple of hours later, and I didn't like the little piece of wood that I stuck in there, and I thought, well, what if I take the old handle and just cut it off and put that into to block the holes? So that's what I'm going to try to do now and see if that ends up looking better and just feeling better. Alright, genius that I am, I was not recording when I cut this, but basically I figured out that this oscillating cutter didn't work well because it vibrated this whole thing, so I used this guy to cut, and magically it's cut. So now let's see if it fits. Alright, so the idea is I could reuse this guy to hold it on and just put it right here. It's not going to be very stable, and it'll move around, but the important thing is that when I close this, no matter what happens to it, it's not in the way. And it seems like that's the case. The downside is it could be out like this when I squeeze the trigger, and I don't think, and so I guess I could pinch my finger in here. So maybe I want to hot glue it or something down there, but I think I like this in general better, so I'm going to go ahead and use this thing to attach it. So what I need to do is the little teeth are kind of bent up from when I took it off, so I need to make it a little bit flatter. So I'll just push down on those teeth a little bit. There we go. Alright, and I think it's going to be a lot nicer. And I guess if it ends up popping back out and pinching my fingers somehow, I'll hot glue it in or something, but for now I think I'm going to leave it like this because I think I like it. So with the old trigger in there, here's what it looks like. So almost looks like it was meant to be that way. A lot better than that piece of wood. Okay, I think that's finally it. I think I probably took that handle off 5 or 6 times, so I'm lucky I didn't strip any more of the screws than I actually did. But my saw is working now, so my 20-plus-year-old saw is still good to go.